You seem utterly convinced you're telling the truth. Would you be willing to testify or give a statement under oath if you were asked?
Well, I'm like everybody else.
I've made a startling discovery. There's good evidence that's recently come to light that back in the Middle Ages, one of the kings of England was illegitimate. And if that's so, it means that every king and queen of our country since shouldn't by rights have sat on the throne.
Little room for doubt. Scientists at the University of Leicester who've spent the past 2 years studying bones found under a car park say they're almost completely sure they are those of 15th century English King Richard III.
There's a 99.999% that these are the remains of Richard III. That's at its most conservative. We would actually suggest it's between 99.999 and 99.99999% that these are indeed the remains of Richard III.
Edward IV was king, but his claim to the throne was fatally flawed. I found evidence that he was conceived not by his royal father, but by a humble archer. It was the summer of 1441. England was at war with France. Edward's mother had gone there with her husband. While he was away fighting, she was rumoured to have had a fling with an English archer based in the Rouen garrison. 9 months later, Edward was born. Within 20 years, Edward became Edward IV. But gossip about his parentage persisted in his lifetime and even after his death. There were rumours flashing round the Tudor court that Edward was illegitimate, and William Shakespeare actually articulates those rumours. He says in Richard III, if I can find it, when that my mother went with child of that insatiate Edward, noble York, my princely father, then had wars in France, and by true computation of the time, found that the issue was not his begot. That's pretty clear, isn't it?
Researchers matched DNA from the skeleton with descendants on Richard III's sister's side of the family and found a match. However, further surprises have been uncovered along with the car park king, who died at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Tests were taken from the living descendants of the male side of the family, relations of Richard III's great-grandfather. No match for DNA was found. This throws into question the official genealogy of Britain's royal family from that point, meaning that many of the country's kings and queens actually had no official genetic claim to the throne.
So why does it matter whether or not Edward IV was legitimate? Well, if I stick this up here, hopefully I can show you. This line at the top here is the great line of British kings through from Alfred the Great to Henry II to Edward III. But after Edward, suddenly the whole thing explodes. It goes bush because it's the War of the Roses and all the kings start dying off like flies until in 1485, when Richard III dies, there are no claimants left except this one, Henry VII. And his claim comes through this line, which is an extremely dodgy one because it's about the fact that John of Gaunt had a mistress, Catherine, and they had children. And that line is specifically barred from inheriting the crown. So in order to legitimise himself, Henry VII married this woman, Elizabeth of York, and her claim is based on the fact that she is the daughter of Edward IV. But if Edward IV is illegitimate, then that invalidates the claim of Elizabeth and consequently of Henry and of Henry VIII and of Elizabeth I and of the Georges and of Victoria and everyone all the way down to the House of Windsor.
However, researchers say the passage of time means the current queen should be safe.
What we see is that royal succession takes various twists and turns over time. So the fact that there may, and it is a very big speculation, there may be a break there, doesn't necessarily have a direct impact on later successions.
What am I doing making a fuss about a centuries-old skeleton in the royal family's closet? Well, to me, it's all about the rules of the club. The monarchy rests entirely on blood and inheritance. There's an absolutely rigid system for passing on the throne. Prince Charles is first in line, then Prince William, then Harry, then Andrew, etc. The chain of power and wealth and privilege depends on two rules. One, you have to be of the royal bloodline, and two, you have to be born legitimate. But what happens if the system goes wrong, if the chain gets broken? 500 years ago, that's exactly what happened, and this is the man responsible.
The revelations don't end there. The study showed Richard had blonde hair and blue eyes, meaning only one of several surviving portraits of the king is true to the subject.
And I would have to take all the legal advice that there was before I was to do that sort of thing. But if push came to shove, the legal advice was to do so, then I would be duty bound to do so.
Because you've said there are many unanswered questions,
Yep.
Everyone affected wants closure. You would help to provide that closure?
If in the right circumstances, yes, I would, because I think there's just as much closure for me as there is for everybody else, and undoubtedly some very strange and unpleasant activities have been going on.
While taking a stroll on New Year's Day, a dog walker found a woman's body right on the grounds of Queen Elizabeth II's royal estate. The same day the Queen was visiting with Prince Philip. This estate is where the royal family goes on holidays. It's where they all celebrated Christmas together this year, and now it's the site of a murder investigation.
Shock.
Officials said Tuesday it looks like the body belonged to a young adult female and was not the result of an accident or a natural death. The area where it was found is completely accessible to the public at all times, and police say it looks like this body has been there for several months, just 3 miles away from where the Queen usually sleeps at night.
Because you've said there are many unanswered questions,
Yep.
Everyone affected wants closure.
And undoubtedly some very strange and unpleasant activities have been going on.
This makes things especially creepy for the Queen, since it was only last March when the body of a man who was absolutely obsessed with her was found near Buckingham Palace.
Shock.
About 3 years after he died.
Because you've said there are many unanswered questions,
Yep.
Everyone affected wants closure. You would help to provide that closure?
If in the right circumstances, yes, I would, because I think there's just as much closure for me as there is for everybody else, and undoubtedly some very strange and unpleasant activities have been going on.
FBI claims that Lord Mountbatten was a pervert.
I'm afraid to say that I'm not the person who can shed light on it.
Newly released FBI files say the aristocrat was bisexual and sexually ferocious.
Well, it's an interesting way of putting it.
The secret reports compiled by the US agency over 3 decades, including during World War II, contain allegations that Mountbatten was a homosexual with a perversion for young boys.
Shock.
The files claim Mountbatten, the former chief of the defence staff, was unfit to direct military operations because of his sexual appetite. He tells how one of Mountbatten's favourite haunts was the Red House in Rabat, which was an upmarket gay brothel used by naval officers. Gay Labour MP Tom Dryburgh, who died in 1976, nicknamed the L Mountbottom.
Now, he may have changed his behaviour patterns in order for that not to be obvious to me.
Rumours of Mountbatten's bisexuality have been hinted at since his death, but the establishment closed ranks.
Shock.
Now the FBI files uncovered by author Andrew Lowney are the first official confirmation the Earl had relationships with men at a time when homosexuality was illegal. The FBI's dossier includes an interview in February 1944 with Elizabeth de la Pole Beresford, Baroness de Size, a friend of the Queen Mother.
It's quite easy, I'm led to believe, for those sorts of people to hide their activities.
Mountbatten was wartime Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia at the time. The Baroness told the head of the FBI's New York field office that Lord Mountbatten and his wife are considered persons of extremely low morals.
Well, it's an interesting way of putting it. You're asking me to speculate on things that I just don't know about.
The report adds she stated that Lord Louis Mountbatten was known to be a homosexual with a perversion for young boys. In Lady Desai's opinion, he is an unfit man to direct any sort of military operations because of this condition. FBI Bureau Chief E.E. Conroy wrote that the Baroness appeared to have no specific motive in making a damning statement. The Mountbattens, their lives include an interview with Anthony Daly, rent boy to the famous in the 70s. Daly had a relationship with Tom Dryburgh and claims Tom said Mountbatten had something of a fetish for young men in military uniform, with high boots and beautiful boys in school uniform. From 1965 until his death, Mountbatten was regimental colonel of the Life Guards, a source of young men. And an unnamed officer claimed that in the mid-1960s, around the time he took charge of the regiment, Mountbatten set up a young officer in a flat in London's Belgravia. Dryburgh's biographer Francis Ween says that Mountbatten, who was also Admiral of the Fleet, tried to seduce a 17-year-old sailor.
Well, it's an interesting way of putting it.
Ween says the naval rating was lined up to go on a picnic for two with Mountbatten when he was visiting Malta. Mountbatten became the focus of FBI interest again during the Suez Crisis, and in 1957, a file referring to Mountbatten's homosexuality was sent to the US Department of Justice, but many official memos referring to the Earl's homosexuality have been redacted or destroyed.
Shock.
One file from April to July 1956 was shredded 2 years ago after Lowry requested the records.
I'm afraid to say that I'm not the person who can shed light on it. And undoubtedly, some very strange and unpleasant activities have been going on for a number of reasons.
What do you think are the most serious issues faced by conservationists and World Wildlife Fund over the next 20 years or so?
95% of the whole of the Atlantic rainforest in Brazil has disappeared in the last 100 years. There is simply nowhere for these animals to live. At the basis of it all is this colossal increase in the human population. It's one of the living species of the planet, but it's reaching plague proportions.
What do you see as the biggest challenges in conservation?
The growing human population.
Well, it's an interesting way of putting it.
Because where we are, there's nothing else.
And do you have views about what should be done about that?
Can't you guess?
Who is that master I sent you?
Please don't make me say his name. Please don't.
Sit out! Come on, sit out!
He's Baphomet!
Well, it could be on a spectrum from mass sterilisation to greater availability of contraception. I don't know what your views are as to what can be done about it.
Well, I think it might be described as a voluntary family limitation.
It's quite easy, I'm led to believe, for those sorts of people to hide their activities.
There are many unanswered questions.
What was up with Prince Harry's hand during that photo op with the First Lady? Was he making a cryptic sign to ward off the devil? That's the kooky theory burning up the internet today. Conspiracy nuts are going wild.
We are tributing him because this guy is too strong, too powerful, too supreme in the spirit realm. You might be seeing him as a little, small, simple, humble boy. But in the spirit realm, when he opens his mouth to praise God or pray, our kingdoms are threatened heavily
speculating about the meaning behind Harry's gesture. His hand is half tucked into his jacket with his pinky and index fingers sticking out. Internet sleuths say he's making devil horns, a symbol that harkens back to the Middle Ages to ward off evil spirits.
Come on, show the first sign. What's the first sign? The first one? Is that how you show the first sign?
Yes!
What does it represent?
It is a way of rendering glory, power, adoration, and above all,
Donc ce signe signifiait qu'effectivement
loyalty
l'autorité puissante
to the
devait
master,
appartenir à ce Dieu de
meaning I have only one and only master.
But we did some digging, and it turns out Harry does this all the time. Body language expert Tanya Ryman is pretty sure Harry's just getting comfortable, and it has nothing to do with the devil.
For me, this was more of a comfort gesture. Covering the stomach helps you feel more relaxed.
Sit out! Come on, sit out!
It helps you feel less vulnerable. And I think that once he heard the cameras going off, he stayed in that position because he wasn't sure what else to do.
I'm afraid to say that I'm not the person who can shed light on it.
It's Baphomet!
It's quite easy, I'm led to believe, for those sorts of people to hide their activities.
Of which kingdom? Kingdom of light or darkness?
The land and the seas, more especially darkness.
The Queen herself has been accused of being involved in abducting children. William Coombs, who's a resident of the downtown east side, he's been on my radio show on Co-op Radio a number of times. He described how in October 1964, he remembered it was the fall, and sure enough, I checked, and the Queen and Prince Philip were in Canada between October 5th and 13th of 1964. He said the Queen and Prince Philip showed up at the Kamloops Catholic Residential School where he was a student. And he said they took all the children down to the riverside for a picnic, and 10 of the children left with the Queen and Prince Philip and never came back, 7 boys and 3 girls.
Well, it's an interesting way of putting it.
He said it was really odd because all the kids were from that area, and they were never seen again their entire life.
Well, that bit I can't help you with because I've no idea.
It's the Queen. It's the Queen. I mean, there is no greater lady than the Queen.
It's Baphomet!
Some very strange and unpleasant activities have been going on.
The expectation is to act very dignified and proper around the Queen. But of course, sometimes nerves get the better of you. Check out 9-year-old Nathan, who was meeting Queen Elizabeth yesterday. Here comes the Queen. Let's just watch this happen.
Going to present the ceremony for us today. We're hosting today. This is our adoptive son.
Right out.
Do you think that she has questions to answer about her role in this?
In the same way that I have questions to answer, in the sense of what was I doing,